Haidong. In this video, we're going to talk about passing and transverse steps. So this video, as well as the 4 following it, are kind of inspired by a seminar that I took a while ago in Pittsburgh that was hosted by Chief Master Jenko, but Chief Master Parnell is also the one who kind of gave some inspiration for this, but this is going to be taking ideas from that and kind of extrapolating it into a more general case, as well as using it in a more general sense. The premise of this is going to be, instead of having very linear footwork, which is kind of what we're used to, especially in the modern Gumdo world, especially also in many types of Taekwondo and also open hand fighting, a lot of it tends to be very linear. Versus being able to go on our happy little angles, which is a little bit more common in other styles like Eskrima, but I would just want to introduce this idea as we kind of take the first step and then kind of build off of that, eventually going up to the drills that the old Federation had us do. Some more shout outs. So the terminology I'm going to be using is taken from Fiore. There's going to be also other ways of describing it. I'll try to use all of those kind of equally. I'm going to be referring to some steps as passing steps and others as transverse steps. These are going to be sort of equivalent to open steps and closed steps, and you'll kind of see what I mean by that as we go through. But the general idea of it, so without a very neutral stance, kind of like standing straight on this way, so a passing step or an open step. More or less, so if I'm kind of like straddling this line here, I'm not going to cross it. More or less, I'm going to be stepping here or here, right? This is going to be very similar to the video that I did before about cutting towards the open or cutting towards the close. This is going to be more about the footwork kind of idea with that. So passing again is, so I'm still kind of straddling that line, but moving one way or the other this way, versus the transverse, so taking that trans portion, right, going across something. This is where I'm actually going to take my both of my feet and my center line completely off the line axis that we already are engaged with. Now, the main idea that I want you to think about is this should be engaged in a partner, right? So right now, if I'm kind of having kind of like an open hand kind of position here, the general sense of a passing step, this is not always going to be true, but I just want to give you some generalities so you can have some sort of foundation kind of play with, knowing that these are generalities, and in fact I encourage you to find counterexamples. So an open step or a passing step generally is used for a nice quick, still offensive motion. So for example, if we're doing kind of more of a standard open hand kind of thing here, a passing step here, notice if I'm passing, I'm still kind of open towards my opponent, so I can still kind of evade as I can kind of have a counter of a sort, right? Versus a transverse step is going to be a lot more closed off. So a generality that I encourage you to find, counterexamples to, is that a passing step is more offensive, kind of like a quick motion that you can kind of counter, versus a transverse step or a closed step. Again, closed because you're kind of like closed off from your opponent here, is going to be kind of setting you up for a bigger counter if you need to later. But in general, the transverse step is going to be kind of defensive, and the open step is going to be more offensive. Something already hinted at is also a passing step is going to be more likely to be a quick counter, as opposed to the transverse step is going to be slower but more powerful. Taking just a few open hand examples just so you can kind of get a good gist of this, right? So a classic just passing would be just a nice quick, gut punch or a hook or anything like that. Versus a transverse, I'm going to use my elbow to block transverse here and maybe have like a nice powered kick from my lagging foot. So defensive initially, and then countering with something a little more powerful. So both of these have good and bad depending on your fighting style, whoever is teaching you, whoever you're fighting. So So all of these things contribute to what style of motion we're going to use. So today is just an introduction to the idea of this motion, right? So kind of taking something from the modern way Gumdo is doing something versus the older way Gumdo was doing something. Again, although I'm using Gumdo as the basis for this, this can be extrapolated to both open hand, other sword styles, and all sorts of other just ways to fight, right? So taking an example from the current Federation kind of way, the first one step, right, is going to be here, right? If I want to have two hands, it's coming straight forward, bang. Same thing if I defend, I'm kind of doing that same thing. Those are supposed to be with sword, by the way. This is not doing anything with an open hand. Even doing the two-person version of it, it's 1, 2, turning behind you, completely linear, right? Versus the older way of doing things. So the way we would attack is we pivoting off on an angle this way, right? And the way we would defend against that is really going off on angles. So there's a change in mentality. So one reason why very linear style of teaching is still common is because it's very easy to do in large groups, in large classes, versus if everyone's doing their own angular stepping, things get kind of confusing very, very quickly. So just keep that in mind as well. And one of the last things I'm going to mention kind of like in this video before we start to do actual examples using the sword, using the open hand, just to kind of give you an idea of how to kind of build up to this, is also your muscle group activation, right? I know it's a little bit harder sometimes if you're doing this open hand. It's a little easier, oddly enough, using with a weapon. But be aware of what muscle groups you're using to actually move around, right? So if I'm here, right, if I'm kind of in more standard kind of, Taekwondo kind of guard, what I typically see when people are moving is they're very kind of like knee and calf oriented, right? They're kind of here, right? And then if they want to evade, they're gonna be like, right? Kind of using the calf to really push off and kind of pivot this way, right? Something I would like for you to play with, again, just see kind of what resonates with you, is actually to use the glutes a lot more. Now there's going to be a drawback to this, as well as a drawback to the calf use, right? So the calf kind of muscle use here is faster, but it's going to be not as good for you long term, right? So if I only do this kind of like twitchy motion, it's not going to help long term. It's not going to be as powerful at the end of it. Whereas if you're here and you activate that back glute to push off, it's going to be a little bit slower, but you're going to be using bigger muscle groups that can withstand that kind of abuse time and time again, which in the long run is going to let you kind of fight a little bit more, deeper into your training. So it's just something I would encourage you to, if you haven't really been thinking about what muscle groups you use when you navigate, now's a good time. But on that same kind of note, so make sure you stay safe, right? So do all these drills, especially the next couple, especially if you're doing it with a partner, do them safely, right? Be aware of how your body is reacting to your motion. But with that, so make sure you stay safe, stay humble, and keep training. Haidong.